we're going to turn to Iran, which has obviously been in the crosshairs, been the subject of a horrific war of aggression by the Americans and Israelis. And, the Persian Gulf is once again on the brink, despite there being a supposed ceasefire in place now after the U.S. launched fresh new strikes yesterday on Iran. And then
defensive,
Iran retaliated
Rania.
this time. Defensive, right? Defensive
Sorry.
strikes. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Big Brother. Defensive strikes. But no, I mean, it's actually wild. Their ceasefire has been in place for a couple months now. And this is the second time in the course of a week, I believe, that the U.S. has launched strikes on Iran, but calling it defensive, saying it's not actually an end to the ceasefire. There's still a ceasefire in place. And Iran this time retaliated against Kuwait. As they have done before, they retaliated against the UAE. And this is happening even as negotiations continue over a possible framework to end this disastrous war. Meanwhile, as we just talked about, Israel has intensified its attacks on Lebanon, raising further doubts about whether Washington is willing or able to restrain Netanyahu as part of any broader regional settlement. So, where do talks stand? Is this genuine diplomacy, or is it just the U.S. buying time to recalibrate before the next round? And how close is the region to spiraling into a much wider war? Joining us to discuss is Omar Baddar, Palestinian-American political analyst based in Washington, D.C. Omar, thank you so much for joining us. It's good to see you.
Absolutely. Always good to be with you.
So let's jump right into it, because, man, it just feels like we're trapped in some kind of time loop, right? Because, 1 hour we hear negotiations are moving in a positive direction. The next hour, we hear threats of escalation and, civilizational apocalyptic destruction. Then suddenly the U.S. is bombing Iran again while insisting diplomacy is still on course and ceasefire is still alive. So, yeah, it feels like we're just trapped in this endless cycle of negotiations and military escalation that's just happening simultaneously. So, Omar, how should we interpret these contradictory developments? Is there actually a coherent U.S. strategy here?
I don't think there's a coherent strategy at all. I think what we're witnessing right now is President Trump flailing. He knows he doesn't have any good options at this stage. You remember he came in promising complete and total Iranian surrender. He said that's the only condition for ending the war. It would mean no more ballistic missiles, no more Iranian alliance with any regional allies that they have, possibly toppling the Iranian government and replacing it with a more U.S. and Israel-friendly government. None of this is on the table. Trump understands that none of this is on the table. So now he's stuck in a situation where either he accepts terms that would essentially be humiliating for Trump, because it would be obvious for everyone that he did not achieve any of his goals and is going to allow Iran sanctions relief and the ability to rebuild itself without having completely cowed to his demands. Or the alternative is a continuing war whose economic consequences for the U.S. are completely unacceptable, devastating the American economy, gas prices shooting up, potentially shortages in all sorts of stuff in the near future if this keeps going, and a very likelihood that Trump's Republican Party would lose the midterm elections. Those are the choices, and Trump does not know what to do. Now, I think that Trump's probably leaning in the direction, if it were up to him personally, of just settling this entire situation, of accepting a deal and trying to essentially sell it as a win, even though it's not, and hoping that people buy that. But he's also surrounded by a lot of people who want this war to continue. The Israel lobby, Senator Lindsey Graham, and the list goes on, of people who see this as a strategic defeat for the United States and insisting on the delusion that just a little bit more pressure or a little bit more killing is going to change the outcome here. And that is simply a fool's errand. But again, with somebody whose ego is inflated as Trump, it might not be that difficult to play to his ego and say, this will be embarrassing. The only option that you have is to keep going. And that might actually sway him. So I think it's very, very difficult to actually figure out which direction we're moving in. But it's obvious from everything that we've seen that Trump does not know what to do.
Well, interesting you mentioned that, Omar, because last weekend when it was announced that a deal might be possible, immediately after we saw warmongers, going out in force in Israel, and even, supporters in Washington. And it was striking because Democrats also joined in on attacking Trump, essentially mocking him for making any compromises in diplomatic negotiations with Iran. And we want to show a couple clips that can illustrate this point. First up, Debbie Wasserman Schultz and her displeasure with negotiations.
I am concerned and frustrated over, again, another potential deal, a negotiation where we're going to unfreeze Iranian assets and give them billions of dollars to be able to control proxies again and to rebuild their ballistic missile program, never mind their drone program, which is incredibly deadly, and they've been increasing their drone capability. So this is deeply concerning. And look, I'm glad that Iran, their capability militarily has been degraded. But if what we get from this initial deal is just going back to where we were before, where Iran did not control the Strait of Hormuz, then what has been accomplished?
Interesting. And one more before we get your reaction, which is our other friend from the state of New Jersey, Cory Booker.
Well, already the president's balance sheet is letting more than $14 billion go through, that during this conflict he allowed them to sell oil. And this deal alone, easing of sanctions on Iran, allowing them to get billions of more, the same deal he criticized, he's already doing worse than. Giving Iran more money, as he has said, will allow them to do things like fuel their terrorist proxies. That's why this war is wrong. He's got us in a situation that's worse than it was before, a more extreme regime. The Strait of Hormuz now is a leveraging point for them. This weak nation has put America in a stalemate, and Donald Trump is being played as a fool that he is for getting us into this in the first place.
Well, it's interesting because also they seem to kind of say the same thing, but can you talk a little bit about the bipartisan nature of the war machine in this country? They seem to have zero concern about economic consequences of the war, not only in Iran, but also at home, the danger of regional escalation, or even the simple fact that the majority of people in the United States are opposed to this war.
Yeah, there's absolutely a bipartisan consensus on this as far as the establishment is concerned. I want to make sure that this is very, very different than the American population. It's obvious the public opinion polling has moved in a very significantly different direction, particularly on the Democratic base. I mean, there's movement on the Republican side as well. But when Debbie Wasserman Schultz talks about how we're allowing them to have billions and all the terrible things, it never occurs to her that we not only allow Israel to have billions, we literally give that from American taxpayers' money directly to that genocidal apartheid regime. And they're carrying out mass terrorism with it left and right. It simply does not occur to them, despite the fact that the American population is awake at this point. What they've seen over the past few years has completely opened their eyes. There is wall-to-wall opposition right now to essentially continuing this absurd relationship that we have with Israel, where you just give them unlimited funding, unlimited diplomatic support, and they just commit atrocities. And this is all money that, frankly, even if you don't care about Palestinians or Lebanese or Iranians, money that should be spent at home in the United States. Americans are, one of very few developed countries that can't have universal health care. We don't provide childcare. There isn't a proper safety net. And to constantly hear from our politicians that we don't have money for all the things that Americans need, but we somehow always have money for Israel's wars in the region is utterly insane. And, for a certain segment of the pro-war machine on the Democratic side, their problem is that Trump is prosecuting the war wrong. It's not that he's waging the war in the first place. What they worry about here is a diminishing of U.S. empire, and they're nervous that Trump is not handling it well, and they wish somebody could do it better, as opposed to a genuine critique of our entire relationship with the region. That if you're interested in genuinely a stable region in which you can, in fact, protect American interests in the long term, that is a completely different relationship that is not based on dominance, but it is simply out of the question for the political establishment in this country right now. We're still operating in a mode in which our job is to impose our will on the region. Israel is effectively the tool in some ways that, our job is to support them, make the region subservient, and any opposition to that is something to be feared. Well, that's not a recipe for long-term stability or for U.S. interest in the long term, because you're going to constantly have a region that is just seething at the injustice of your policies. And you can build a very, very different kind of relationship if you have a genuine relationship of cooperation. And that would have to start with putting the reins on that terrorist genocidal regime in the region that is just bombing everybody with complete and total impunity. We need a fundamental change in American policy. And it's just incredibly depressing to see how out of touch the Democratic establishment continues to be. Although there are plenty of signs of movement with the way that certain local and state elections are going, that wake-up call, I think, is inevitable at this point. It's just a question of how much more time is going to pass, how many more Palestinians and Lebanese and Iranians and others are going to die while we sit here and wait for that policy change. I think we still have a responsibility to push for it as strongly as we can.
Yeah, and to what you're saying, I mean, Lebanon is a real test case, which I think is why Iran has made it, such a major centerpiece of its demands is a ceasefire in Lebanon, because it's a test case on, are the Americans willing to rein in the Israelis, even if it's just to stop the Israelis from bombing. They're not even saying stop bombing all of Lebanon. They're actually just saying right now a red line is Beirut and the southern suburbs. And today we saw the Israelis bombed the southern suburbs of Beirut. And they did that obviously with a green light from the Americans. So it's a test case for Iran, because if the Americans can't rein in the Israelis on Lebanon, how is Iran supposed to expect the Americans to rein in the Israelis on Iran? Because this is supposed to be the war to end all the wars on Iran. So we'll see how that plays out. But I do want to ask you about the Gulf states, because, we've seen in these repeated cycles of U.S. strikes on Iran that what follows is Iranian retaliation by targeting areas connected to American military presence in the Gulf, right? And so that raises huge questions about the role of the Gulf monarchies hosting U.S. bases while also trying to avoid being dragged into regional war. And the UAE seems like fine with it for some reason, but the rest of the Gulf states are now really questioning how they should navigate this moment, and what their relationship, should be moving forward into the future. I mean, one of Iran's demands has been, they've kind of like relented a little bit, that these bases can no longer be in the Gulf states because they're obviously being used to attack Iran. I mean, that's probably not going to happen. However, what do you see, moving forward in this kind of reconfiguration of the region when it comes to the relationship between the Gulf states and the U.S.?
It's hard to say. What is obvious, I think, from as you pointed out, is that the relationship cannot go back to what it was over the past years. We're at a very, very major turning point, and different forces in the Gulf are pulling in different directions, frankly. I think the same portion of the Gulf understands what a horrible idea all of this has been, understands how damaging it's been, and they're desperate for a way out of this war. But you have a more hawkish wing, like in the UAE, that sees an end to this war that leaves Iran intact as a regional force to be unacceptable. They have thrown their lot completely with Israel on this one. They're in an unprecedented alliance that we've never seen between an Arab country and Israel. And they're insisting, what they would prefer here is seeing this war all the way to its end, even if it means significantly more damage in the UAE. They view that as a price worth paying. I think that's complete and total insanity. There is a delusion there about what is possible and how it would play out. But yeah, there's not going to be a return to the relationship between the Gulf and the United States that we've seen before all of this, simply because the U.S. has proven that it is unable to protect those countries. We saw overwhelmingly all the air defenses move to Israel to protect Israel and essentially abandoning the Gulf. And then Trump comes on the back of that and says any deal with Iran, the payback from the Gulf has to be that they have to all collectively normalize relations with Israel and follow the Abraham Accords, the so-called peace deal that is anything but a peace deal. It's essentially an arms deal between governments that already have a tacit alliance under the table with Israel, trying to declare that and sell it as a peace deal, even though it has actually made war inevitably much more likely, and as it has in fact played out. I think it has to be a moment of reckoning for the Gulf, especially with somebody like Trump in power, seeing how reckless he is. He was just talking recently about possibly blowing up Oman if they try to, have an arrangement in the Straits that they don't approve of. I mean, that's, again, yes, of course the U.S. has significant leverage over these countries that have decided to essentially use the U.S. as protection. That's the relationship that they have. But they will not accept bullying on that level. This is simply an extremely loud wake-up call that if Trump's idea is to essentially treat them like servants and to declare that openly, that you do what we tell you to do, obviously these countries, if they're looking out for their own interests, are going to be looking for different options and a different configuration that does not leave them completely dependent on the whims of a completely reckless and lunatic US president.
Yeah, and then there's also the Israel factor I just want to throw out here too, because, we talk a lot about greater Israel. And when we think of the idea of greater Israel, it's often thought of as this like expanding of the borders and expanding settlements, into Gaza, taking over the West Bank, taking over South Lebanon and parts of Syria, which is absolutely true. And what, the sort of messianic zealots who are in charge of big parts of the Israeli government ultimately want to do. However, there's also this aspect of greater Israel that is about weakening every single state in the region, collapsing in some form or sort of dismantling or chopping up, into smaller states so that they're too weak to ever pose any sort of like economic or military challenge to Israeli hegemony across the region. And we hear it increasingly in Israeli rhetoric. Particularly, I think we've heard it the most about, after Iran, Turkey is next. And we've even heard some rumblings about, and then Saudi Arabia. And now, I was talking earlier about this clip I saw before we started recording of the former, of the Israeli spy, Jonathan Pollard, who literally gave U.S. intelligence secrets to the Israelis. Nuclear secrets, I believe. But anyways, he was on some program in Israel talking about how next is Turkey and then Egypt. And I think, if you're these Gulf states or really any state in the region, even if you've normalized with the Israelis, except for maybe the UAE, it does seem like a lot of these countries, for their own self-interest, not because they care about Palestinians or Lebanese or whatever, but for their own self-interest, are increasingly recognizing that Israel as it exists today, in this sort of messianic Zionist, most aggressive form it exists in, poses a threat in some shape or form to everyone.
Absolutely. And obviously we're in the midst of a very depressing regional situation, but I do want to end things on a bit of a high note. And I see a flicker of light here in that I think that the reason why Israel is behaving in a completely deranged way right now is because they see the clock is ticking on American support. They thought they had an opportunity in the aftermath of October 7th to literally commit genocide while the world watches and applauds, and that is not how it turned out. Despite living in the United States, where the media establishment and the political establishment essentially did cover up what Israel was doing and try to put it in a positive light, it is simply not the way people consume information anymore. That you have people throughout the entire world getting access to the real images of what was unfolding in Gaza and having a much deeper and more sophisticated political understanding of the events as they were unfolding, that you could no longer hide what Israel was doing, that they're used to having this massive propaganda machine that can essentially always present Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East and the source for, freedom and human rights and all that. All of that is gone. It is over. And the extent to which American public opinion is shifting, I think Israel sees that they have a short window of opportunity, certainly guaranteed as long as Trump is president, but completely unclear how much beyond that, where they can behave with impunity, counting on American military funding to continue. And because the clock is ticking on that, they are trying to do as much damage as possible. They are trying to defeat all of their regional adversaries, and they're trying to get rid of as many Palestinians and as many Lebanese as they possibly can in order to remake that region so that they can potentially stand on their own and continue as a dominant force after U.S. support collapses. I don't think they're going to be able to do it. I mean, just look at what's happening in South Lebanon right now. Just an endless stream of footage coming out from the south of Israeli tanks being blown up day after day. And of course, the Israeli response, unsurprisingly, is to massacre journalists and medics and children and blowing up civilian infrastructure. It is the Gaza playbook. And Smotrich himself just essentially said that explicitly. Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, proposed that for every soldier hurt in South Lebanon by a Hezbollah drone, that Israel should flatten 100 buildings throughout Lebanon. Now, if Osama bin Laden had said, for every al-Qaeda member that you kill, we're going to take down 100 buildings in New York, everybody would understand that as terrorism. There would be no confusion about it. And yet, Israeli officials are speaking this openly about the mass terrorism they're imposing. And we don't still recognize the Israeli government as a terrorist organization, which it absolutely is. And I think that's completely bonkers. And Americans are fed up with it, and change is absolutely coming. We are enduring the darkest hour in a way, but I have no doubt that the coming years are going to be much better than the ones we're witnessing right now.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the Israelis and all of the warmongers we saw throw a hissy fit over the weekend are now going to throw another one, because recent reports say that the White House is confirming initial reporting from Axios that there's a memorandum of understanding that the president still hasn't signed, but it's a 60-day ceasefire. The Strait of Hormuz would be reopened. Iran would promise to clear all mines within 30 days and pledge not to build a nuclear weapon. And the U.S. would discuss relief and unfreezing Iran. We'll see what it looks, in the next hour from now, the Americans do another defensive strike, but we'll continue to monitor the situation. Omar, really appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always good to be with you, Rania. Take care, guys.